Okay, sorry about that, guys. I am back. I had to actually plug in my laptop because I was running out of power. So what you're seeing here on the screen is basically the website for Grid Plus. It's titled "Welcome to the Future of Energy." We're going to get into what they do, and I'm going to also provide some critique on this project because I'm uniquely qualified, I feel, to review this. I do work as some of you guys know I am in the power industry. I've been working in this industry for a couple years now, so I do feel like I can provide some interesting insight. So anybody who's maybe been interested in Grid Plus, you might find this video helpful. Please feel free to share it with the team. Probably going to add some really neat questions, maybe along as I review this with you guys. So if you have any questions, please hit me up in the chat. So without further ado, we'll just do a quick little overview on their website. Looks like they're looking at Grid Plus drives green energy. So basically they're looking to create economic incentives, market-based energy pricing. So it's basically a distributed energy resource model, decoupling away from the centralized grid. And I'm going to explain what that actually means in layman's terms. Looks like they have a device that they're calling an agent. That's going to provide some local control to interface the power, and then they're also looking at predicting usage. So what it looks like they're doing, guys, is a couple things. One, they're trying to, well, let's get into the white paper. Let's not summarize it here. So here's the white paper, guys. I think this is version 2.0. Okay, so I just downloaded this from gridplus.io for those that are interested in taking a look at this. Obviously, this project is being supported by Consensus. You can see their logo there. So a couple sections here. There's an introduction, there's value propositions, there's an intelligent agent, which is what I'm most interested in. There's also the tokens, business model, experience and team, and then they round that with the appendix, as well as the advisors. So here's the abstract, guys. This is talking about the general trends in distributed energy resources, or also known as DERs. Examples of this include panels, like your solar panels on your house, wind turbines. More newer examples of that would be like a battery system. So in like Southern California, we've seen a lot of interest in deploying battery storage technology. These are used to basically perform what's called peak shaving. So what that means, guys, is if you have a large business that, let's say, consumes a large amount of AC usage, okay, maybe during the daytime to offset some of the demand, you can install solar panels on your business. However, at night, obviously, there is challenges just by the way inherently solar panels work to generate power locally. So what you might want to do is install a battery bank with that solar power, and that will allow you to offset your energy demand from the power utility. Now, the other interesting dynamic that's occurring is more of a market-based, a decentralized market space for buying and selling power. So I think that's the other dimension that Grid Plus is looking to do, in which if you had those assets such as solar or batteries, now instead of just consuming the power locally for your business or your residents, you're able to sell that into the grid. I'm going to get into some of the challenges with actually doing that from the experience I have. Again, I'd love to hear the team's input on this, but I'm going to share my unique perspectives in this domain for those that are interested. So in a sense, that's what they're talking about here. And what they're getting at here, guys, is moving away from the centralized system. And what that means, guys, is today most utilities function as one, I guess, a controlling entity that has generation. And that generation is typically coal power. It could be also natural gas. There are some sources of power that are more green, quote unquote. You also have some hydro. But those are large machines, large systems, and basically the power makes its way to your house through a series of transmission lines. So usually that power is produced at anywhere between 480 volts to 13,000 volts. and then it's stepped up to 500 kV. And the reason why that's done is to minimize the power losses as it transmits to your location. It's then stepped down through a place called a substation. So then the voltage goes back down, and eventually makes its way to your local pole top transformer or pad mount transformer into your house. Okay, so that's how power flows today. What they're looking to do here is basically leverage local distributed generation sources. I already mentioned some of those: solar, battery storage, even a car potentially in the future. So like a Tesla vehicle could serve as a source of power, right? That you can interconnect and serve power to your neighbors, for example, and get paid for that. Okay. So this is the promise. This is what they're looking to do: is create this marketplace. They mentioned that the Consensus Energy team has several years of experience, basically demonstrating these proofs of concepts. So they're looking to, looks like, demonstrate the production-ready blockchain-based energy solution to actually do this. Now, that's not the only thing they're doing. This team is proposing to develop a hardware and software stack to create an Ethereum-enabled gateway and connect Internet of Things devices. So in the future, most of your devices, you know, your appliances and other things will be basically, you know, have some communication control with this IoT-managed energy system. So we're going to have to see how that actually works, but the idea is that, you know, there's going to be a plug-and-play control mechanism through this centralized device where the devices themselves can coordinate with one another, manage power consumption, and do it in a way that minimizes basically your bill, okay? And that could also be used to determine when the energy storage devices at your house sell power back into the grid to make you the most money, obviously, right? So this is the software stack that'll work in conjunction with the smart agent to make those payments, and uses these so-called designated payment channels, which is shown here, and a rated network hub when available. So that's what this is about, guys. It's about the architecture and infrastructure. Looks like both its software and hardware, okay, to do this. And they're mentioning here that the smart agent will be able to programmably buy and sell electricity on behalf of the user and manage smart loads. So again, examples of that would be AC systems, Tesla Powerwalls, and, you know, a Nest thermostat that can interface and talk to that device. So that sounds really interesting, guys. They talk about some important information here. It says, one of the things is here, it says, consequently, actual results may differ materially from those that might be anticipated from the statements and information set forth herein. So, this is a little legal disclaimer there, I guess, that most of these projects have. That's not really that surprising. So we get into the introduction, the Energy Smart Chain here. There's a brief introduction that talks about how systems are designed today. I already gave you guys a synopsis of that with generation, transmission, and distribution, as well as retail. So it looks like this particular project is focused, I get the hint that they're focused right now mainly in Texas. Now, you know, my experience is mostly in California. But, you know, in California, of course, being deregulated. So in deregulated markets, you know, one of the things in this white paper you need to keep in mind is that when they say, you know, retailer refers to basically your utility, okay? So examples of that would be Green Mountain Energy and Reliant Energy. In California, it could be something like Pacific Gas and Electric. So here's, you know, a diagram of the electrical grid today. This kind of provides a visual example of what I just described. So you have your generation, which is largely centralized, has to go through a large, you know, very high voltage transmission line to minimize the power, hits the substation, and then it feeds out from there. This is usually at 500 kV, and you're looking at, you know, somewhere around maybe 33 kV or 66 kV at the sub-transmission line. And then you have 12 kV from the last substation to your house. And then that's basically interfaced to a transformer. So that's the way the market works today. Deregulated and regulated and deregulated markets. So this is showing the breakdown of the two groups. That is, you have some markets that are so-called regulated and some markets that are deregulated. And they actually include in this snapshot gas markets as well as electricity. So the electrical deregulated markets would be in the dark blue. So you can see California is deregulated for electricity and also for gas, it looks like, whereas Texas is mainly, it looks like, just deregulated for electricity. So what does this all mean, guys? Well, in regulated markets, really 4 entities in the energy supply can operate as a single vertically integrated monopoly. Basically, they have control over everything. And the 4 things, they talk about here, they basically would have control over the generation, transmission, distribution, that type of thing, along with the retail. So they basically have no competition, okay? It's not really a free market. So what they're saying here is deregulated markets obviously offer more competition akin to a free market because there are many companies that sell their services in a marketplace where there's many different options. And usually, to facilitate this management, you have what's called a nonprofit energy system operator, or ISO. So an example of that in California would be like, it's called CalISO, and they basically run the transmission system. So they decide how to manage that system to basically transmit power, bulk power to different systems. And they're independent from the power companies themselves, which many of them are Fortune 500 listed. Okay. So their main job, guys, just so you know, an ISO, they're basically in charge of managing the grid stability. What do we mean by that? Well, they look at things like the frequency, right? All of our appliances in the U.S. are built to run on 60 hertz. Obviously, if the frequency differs from that, a lot of machines could be damaged, and a lot of appliances wouldn't work properly. So that's just one example. The other thing they do is they look at voltage. So there's a number of different standards that basically they look at maintaining to ensure that we have a stable and reliable grid, okay? And this job is mainly done with the monitoring through these systems through what's called a SCADA. It's basically supervisory control and data acquisition. It's just a really nerdy way of saying you have computers and communication systems, and basically you have a way to monitor the status of equipment on the grid, and you have the ability to control them, okay? So you can open and close switches, you can change the speed of a generator to alter maybe the frequency. So there's a lot of things that you can do there, and those are just 2 examples. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that because the scope of this work isn't to give you a Power Systems 101 course. It's to understand the implications for what they're doing here, okay? But it does talk about, the SCADA system creating signals for the real-time energy as well as service markets. So I talked about, ramping control, frequency regulation, and voltage support. These market signals, are provided to market participants, and these people then can bid into the market and provide the services needed. So an example of that would be not even on a transmission grid, but you can have this on a distribution grid. If there is a voltage problem, okay, one of the common things right now in a lot of distribution systems is you have long distribution lines in some areas, not all, and as you get further down the end of the line, you have potentially voltage problems. Historically, distribution systems, utilities that manage these systems, they've managed this by installing what's called capacitor banks. Okay, either capacitor banks, they've installed load tap changers maybe at the substation to change the voltage. They've also installed voltage regulators. Now, obviously this equipment, it basically takes money to install, it takes money to maintain. One of the thoughts with these distributed energy resources, or DERs, is to utilize systems such as solar or battery storage systems that the residences have or commercial owners have, and those be used to provide the voltage support. You can actually do that. So it's another way to basically help manage and smooth out some of the issues on the grid, and maybe reduce the cost of managing those things, because the cost maybe of deploying a traditional technology may be higher. Whereas if a consumer already has those technologies, it might make sense to leverage them in that way and pay those people money for helping to support the grid. Okay, the issue with that in some cases is the reliability of those distributed systems. Although many people could argue that distributed systems in themselves are more reliable than centralized systems. So that's really one of the questions here, is whether that actually makes sense and whether there's enough technology adoption to make it such that alternative distributed energy resources actually can be used in a lot of these markets. In California there is a lot of battery systems, a lot of solar systems, so I could see it working there. I'm not too certain about the deployment numbers in Texas to comment as to whether this is a viable alternative from the perspective of the utilities. Now, we haven't gotten into the perspective of the motivations for the consumer, and there's a lot of that as well. So we're going to touch on that. But this just talks about the the value proposition for utilities even with this project, and it's really how the grid is managed itself, and using the distributed energy resources to help manage the grid as opposed to traditional devices, which cost lots of money to maintain, as I just mentioned. The other issue here is, so it says retailers are not responsible for powering customers directly, but are responsible for metering and billing. In addition to paying for generation, transmission, distribution, consumers also must pay fees to their retailer. Again, a retailer is basically just your local utility which provides you the power. And so there's a lot of marketing, administration, and marketing risk compliance for bad debts and customer funds, and that is true. And this can eat up some percentage of the average price of the electricity, and I'd agree with that. The other component that you have is, power. The power companies themselves are a. Let me just check to make sure the stream is live here. Yes, it is. The other thing you have to understand here is that electric markets themselves are highly regulated. It's not easy to just make a startup and get in there, because you have a lot of oversight and regulation, a lot of requirements for power companies to follow. So, one of the challenges I think with this project, and I'm going to keep going here, but I just want to say, one of the challenges with this project will be getting buy-in from the regulators, from my perspective. I know they've made some headway in Texas to do that, but there will be some challenges maybe to do that on a much larger level, guys. So that's a big risk for this project, and we'll have to see how well they're able to, show that they have those agreements, and how well this product is able to be integrated and implemented on the system. Okay, and that's just one of the risks here, but I just want to highlight that. So here you see residential versus industrial pricing. This is talking about the price cents per kilowatt hour. And you can see they have, I believe here, for 5 states listed, California being a big one. I mean, you can see the big margins between residential and industrial. So industrial customers, the average price is somewhere around 11 cents. For our retail, or I should say residential customers, you're somewhere around, industrial's around 11 cents, residential's around 19 cents. So that's almost double, guys. Now, you got to keep in mind that some of this is also due to the fact that those industrial customers sometimes take their power at higher voltages, which means that the amount of losses the utility must absorb in providing that power is lower. So they're able to basically give them a lower rate to account for some of that. I don't think it counts for everything, but that's one of the things to keep in mind. And they also purchase a lot more power individually, each of those industrial customers. So there's a lot of drivers here, guys, with explaining some of that. And in some cases, those industrial customers themselves foot the bill for a lot of the machine and equipment. Okay, so sometimes they take that power at a higher medium voltage level, and that might explain some of the quote-unquote savings you're seeing there between industrial and residential customers. So they're showing here that a lot of that is due to the difference being that the consumers pass some additional fees, and that is true. So it talks about existing retailers. These guys are responsible, again, for billing and interacting with customers in the last mile of the energy supply chain. Typically, only about 50% of the cost of retail electricity is used to pay for the electrical energy itself. So there's another 50% there that is obviously administration, marketing. We already talked about all that stuff. It's basically a repeat of what we just said. So it talks about here, they do legacy utility credit check process, and the likelihood of a customer defaulting on payments. So that needs to be taken into account. And yes, retailers are credit facilities because they provide energy on credit, and then the bill comes in various basis, like maybe monthly or bi-monthly. So they do deploy risk assessment algorithms, and obviously this is a huge, this is a risk that they need to keep into mind, because the power usually is charged on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. So now they talk about challenges with renewals. One is obviously the cost of it. So they're talking about here that grid decentralization is empowering consumers to obviously, I guess, turn into what they call prosumers. So approximately 38% of the residential electricity pays for the transmission infrastructure and losses, and we just talked about that. So obviously the thesis here that they're getting at, without reading all this stuff, is that if you can generate the power locally, you basically take away, you're able to eliminate the 38% of the power that, or the cost you would need, because you're not using the transmission lines to send that power, right, for you to consume. You're generating it locally. Obviously, one of the issues with this that is not being said is that the reliability of the renewals. So what I mean by that is you obviously don't have sun hit the earth every day. You're going to have some periods of cloud cover, and so when that happens, you would need a robust transmission line to provide that power. And the power companies, they obviously are running a business, so they have to invest capital in that equipment, and they need to find a way to make money on it. So I'm not sure how that would actually work. It's not like the transmission system just goes away, and it's not like it's just paid for, because it's usually long-term investments that are built into this long-term model. So that's one of the challenges I see here. And in fact, in some cases, when you deploy photovoltaics, another challenge is that in some cases the grid needs to actually be upgraded. So maybe the distribution lines aren't rated to carry large amounts of distributed energy, if you can believe that. In some cases, I've seen that this actually results in what's called distribution upgrades. Okay, so they need to change the size of conductors or cable to basically allow the power to be fed back into the grid. So that could actually generate more costs. I know that sounds very counterintuitive, but it does happen. And that would be one of the challenges here. So that talks about here. In some regions, PV penetration is so high that more energy is pumped back into the grid, and this results in overvoltage. So yes, in those cases, the utility basically needs to add more equipment to monitor that condition and make sure that basically the voltage doesn't become so high to damage other equipment. That's a huge challenge, especially in California. This is what's called the so-called duck curve. What this shows, guys, is the amount of power being generated based on the hour of the day. And you can see like most of the power is actually generated between the hours of, say, 9 a.m. and around, I would say, 4 p.m. And what's interesting, though, is that your load, so the load actually peaks when the distributed energy, the solar systems, like start to ramp down. So the challenge with this is you have a lot of solar generation, but you have that solar generation when you don't need it. And so they kind of named this the duck curve. It's very famous in the power industry, and this is actually California's electrical load, earlier this year, okay? So I'll kind of explain that to you guys. We're not going to read this all because I just summarized what that means, guys. If you have more interest in it, take a look at this chart. It kind of gets into, again, the blue line, which I didn't mention, is the solar, okay? The gray line is the wind, which there's not a whole lot of. Well, the cool thing about wind, though, is that you can see it's pretty consistent in areas where it's deployed. And then you see the load, which is the dark line. And you can see here again, around when people come home, which is around, anywhere between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m., that's when you start to see usually your highest peaks. So the only way to combat that with distributed energy resources is by deploying more battery systems. If you don't have battery systems, you could have solar, but most of that demand is going to be provided by the grid itself, like by the large systems. It's not going to be handled locally because there's no solar power at night. Obviously, the sun is out. So that's the duck-bill curve, guys. Hopefully, I explained that well enough for everybody to understand. This talks about the price per warranted kilowatt hour for different types of energy storage systems. You could see that on the higher end, you have around 35 cents per kilowatt hour for this cell type system, and Tesla's Powerwall's around a little bit of a third of that cost at 14 cents. Okay, so it talks about now using Ethereum in electricity markets. This talks about the project here, Grid Plus, providing an accounting layer for the energy ecosystem. They're going to use smart contracts. So blah, blah, blah. It's just more lingo. They talk about here, traditional payment processors typically charge fees of 1 to 2.5%. So they're talking about maybe reducing this further. So how much further? I'm kind of curious to know. And they're also talking about by pushing the market signals to consumers, it allows them to make smarter decisions about their energy usage. So with that said, gets more into Ethereum. It describes what it does. We all have explained, or you can find videos on what Ethereum is about. This is not the scope of this topic, so I'm going to move on. This talks about the tokens. Again, not really relevant to the discussion in detail. I think you guys all know what tokens are. This talks about stable tokens, payment channels. These are all various foundations that most projects are using now. So we're going to get into more of the meat of where this project starts to, okay, we're going to get into the value proposition. That's what I was looking for. So value propositions. So Grid Plus can immediately introduce efficiencies in the electricity retailing by leveraging the public Ethereum blockchain. So in the short term, this is more of an energy retailer model. What they're saying here is that Grid Plus will operate as a commercial electricity retailer in deregulated markets. Examples of that, again, are California and Texas. They're talking about, here 50% of the retailer's costs are not associated with the purchase of wholesale energy and can potentially be removed through better technology. Lower variable cost. So I think this maybe has some promise. It talks about, billing and settlement right now are mainly spreadsheets and paper mail. So they're talking about automating this. So that's one potential application that seems pretty neat. And then in addition, and they're saying that's part of their automation scheme. And then they're saying here that all payments are recorded automatically and moved from one smart contract to another without needing traditional payment processors. So I don't know how much actual, if that's their main thing, I mean, I don't know if you need a blockchain to do that. That's my own opinion. But, it is a huge thing. I think it's very interesting that they listed that as their first benefit, really, or their first role. Again, not very impressive there, but let's go on to the next one, eliminating bad debts. So they're talking about here that Grid Plus allows or user agency allows Grid Plus to remove or eliminate costs related to risk. So this talks about rather than pooling risk as legacy utilities do, basically Grid Plus will require customers to pay their electricity in real time. So this is true. This will eliminate risk because it will, instead of maybe being charged on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, basically those charges will take place maybe on 15-minute intervals or something like that. The one challenge maybe with doing this is if you actually have a, let's say, solar system and battery system, you may have like a net energy metering application. So in theory, maybe on cloudy days, you're going to be charged, and you wouldn't necessarily get the net effect benefit back until your solar system is, seeing the sun and you're producing energy back for another customer. So I don't know how many people are going to be happy with that, or they're going to have to explain that in a little bit more detail, because that could be a little bit annoying as opposed to just settling the bills maybe on a monthly basis, which smooths out a lot of that volatility on a day-to-day basis in terms of energy output. Okay, so let's go to the next section here. That was, again, that title, that was eliminating bad debts. So they require customers to make a refundable deposit that can partially be drawn down if the smart agent fails to pay on time. So again, that's just eliminating, I guess, the risk. How much risk a utility takes for, I guess, people defaulting on not paying. I don't, honestly, in my experience, there's not a huge amount of customers that have actually defaulted on paying their power. I mean, power is an integral component to our lives. So I'm a little bit skeptical, to be honest with you, about how much, quote-unquote, bad debt this will eliminate. When you think about debt, actually, for most electrical companies, a lot of it is massive investments in large, equipment, infrastructure replacement projects. It's not, I think, defaulting, but I could be totally wrong there, and I'd love to get some clarification from the team on that. So they're talking about here lowering the marketing costs because they're going to eliminate a lot of that on the retail side. They also anticipate customer acquisition costs decreasing over time. They're calculating that maybe 30% per year. It will be much lower customer turnover, which can be as high as 30% per year. That I would like to see more info on. They do have a citation here on that, so maybe I can check that out on my own time. Now let's go into the long-term markets, because that's more interesting. So they're talking about this frictionless access to wholesale energy markets. They're market-driven price fluctuations. Now it talks about here as the cost of batteries drop, there will eventually come a time when it is a rational consumer's economic interest to purchase a battery to arbitrage energy prices and provide ancillary services to the electrical grid. Now here's a risk, guys, because one of the things I mentioned is that and I think Mike B also mentioned this, by the way, but I mentioned it again. Power companies and just power systems in general are very heavily regulated. And right now, especially in California, some utilities do not consider battery systems generation. So people have the option to install battery systems, and the best that the power companies give them is basically a net energy metering, so they can net out some of their power. But they don't actually make money off of they wouldn't bill them excess power for throwing that power back into the grid from the battery. It would have to be from a solar panel, which that is considered a generator, but a battery is not. I don't know if that's the same in Texas, but I thought that was one interesting nugget I'd throw in for maybe people interested in this project, and it would be an excellent question for the team, how they envision getting around that, because the economic incentive to install a battery would be limited. The application would be specific to just net energy metering, which is just netting out your demand, but not really making money. So maybe limited there. I mean, still neat. And in fact, the other thing I'd also mention with this is that many utilities already offer this solution. So they already offer, net energy metering as an application. They can sign a contract with you, and basically, if you install that battery system, you net out your powers. I don't know, again, how much of a benefit this is because this already exists in some ways. The application to do that. Now let's go on to the next one. It's enabling efficient markets. So computation and allocation of cost. Fees are built in a non-dynamic way. The cost of the infrastructure over all market participants on a per kilowatt hour usage basis. But they do not consider that each customer's kilowatt hour represents different real costs because of geography, network connection, topology, and time of use. One issue with this, though, I see, guys, and I know what they're getting at. They're saying that basically if you have more closer sources of power, say you have a local PV system, okay? If you have a local PV system and it's close to you and you need that power, the cost of actually acquiring that power to, running through your neighbor's home, through a transformer, back on the grid, and to your home is very small. It doesn't use much of the grid. So in fact, the cost should be less. The challenge with this, though, could be that what do you do in areas that have basically no solar? Like you have some areas maybe in quote-unquote disadvantaged areas that have no solar. And you have other areas that have solar. In theory, the cost then would not be, in effect, equal, even though, from a geographic perspective, those customers are maybe within 20 miles from one another. That could be seen as a complaint for those customers. They could, say that they're at a disadvantage in terms of pricing and access to fair, a just price. And moreover, people who are more affluent, are now getting a better price for energy. That's a huge issue with this, guys, I see. I just want to mention that. And I, again, love to hear what the team has to say about that. Do they have a plan to maybe deploy and subsidize solar systems to even out that price model? Again, that could be like a lawsuit for a lot of these, power companies that may partake in this, or any state that partakes in this, because that could be like seen as somehow providing some advantage of one, geography over another. And power is just one of those things that is considered a utility. So, in theory, it's a little bit different than, like transportation or Ubering or food. You can't look at it the same way. So there's a potential issue there, guys. Talks about here, so that was section 3.2.1. We're going to get into natively supporting peer-to-peer markets. So it talks about geographically and topologically segmented markets. So they're talking about locational marginal pricing. And I think it just goes to what I just mentioned about trading locally power systems. Again, it goes back to that question of will this be seen as some advantage for one area of a city over another? I have some major concerns with that myself. 3.23 gets into integration of ISO, or independent system operator wholesale markets. So wholesale markets trade what are called forward contracts, which is a contract promising to deliver energy at some future time. That is true. Now, obviously, there's counterparty risk when interacting with the market, and they, on a large basis, they are taking into account that risk, and it adds cost. But if they extend the technology developed for residential businesses into the ISO, and they're really having no distinction between the two, you're going to be able to minimize more of that risk and have more participants to interact with this market. And one of the key things here is that where the lines of demarcation are for ISO, or independent system operators. In California today, I can tell you that ISOs are mainly at the transmission level. They do not have any involvement on the distribution level. So for this project to be successful, one of the contingencies or one of the requirements will be that the Cal ISO or something like it will basically have, some say on distribution. And they talked about this for a couple years now. They've talked about a distribution independent system operator, okay, but nothing definitive at this time. So a lot of this hinges on changing regulatory frameworks, at least in California. Maybe in Texas, maybe they already have that at this point. I don't know. I'd love to hear that from someone who knows. Let's get into the intelligent agents. So Grid Plus will be designing in a way that does not require Grid Plus customers to have a detailed understanding of how cryptocurrencies work. Yeah, let's actually get into the meat of it. So they're talking about this Grid Plus Smart Agent prototype. The basic usage of it is it's a computer that pays for the customer's usage in real time. And they're talking about here that the customer purchases US dollar stable tokens. Here, guys, here's another interesting finding. If you remember my previous video on Amisago, okay, and the layers they're making, they did talk about these, what are called fiat tokens, and I think I've given you guys some examples of that on like BitShares. BitShares has these fiat tokens, okay, and the idea with the fiat tokens is that you're able to have a cryptocurrency that is stable. It's not fluctuating in value. It could potentially smooth out a lot of the volatility with everyday purchases. It looks like Grid Plus is hoping that there would be something like that. They're calling this the Bolt, and you can actually do this with a credit card or bank transfer. Now, I'd be curious how this Bolt is basically developed. What is going to be in the reserve to actually give it value? Because obviously, if something doesn't have value or the right models are not implemented, there could be a big risk there in terms of that price stability. I think I already mentioned to you guys, like for BitShares, I think the requirement was like a 2-to-1 backing in terms of reserve. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but I don't know. These are very new technologies, so we're going to have to see if this is something that they can actually pull off. I think BitShares, fiat tokens have been around for some time, but the jury's still out about how much regulatory pressure there will be on this technology as well. So that's another risk, guys, here. But this shows you the basic agent process. So it talks about checking the balances and checking the open payments and the actual signed messages, and then the channels. So they have these payment channels, which I kind of understand that from a high level. Let's get into the smart agent registration and key generation. I don't know if there's much here. This is more technical stuff about how the system boots up and whatnot. The advanced usage is here, so you have the independent system operator markets. You have Grid Plus with the wallet and the signing agent. We already talked about that. And then you have like third-party APIs and devices such as Nest. You have maybe like your Powerwall, okay, and those are able to communicate between the Grid Plus agent device and these devices, which basically you're using Grid Plus as a intermediary or facilitator between these two systems. So one is the ISO, and the other one is your end user devices. This further gets into the Wi-Fi hub, your smartphone, and then the actual devices. Because remember, these are APIs. These just allow communication. And then these are the actual end devices, the physical devices. So this would be the system architecture they're demonstrating. Okay, that's understandable. And it would seem to work, okay, for at the household level and the commercial level, I can see this working. So then it gets into smart agent energy trading. So it talks about here that independent system operators, they manage wholesale markets, and utilities buy it for resale to their customers. it is a gross oversimplification, but it is, does hit on the gist of it. So they have higher degrees of complexity, largely driven from the fact that load on the electrical grid must match. Yes, that is in fact, just the law of physics. At least now, until we have more battery storage systems put on. But obviously the energy you generate, it's consumed nearly instantaneously. Okay. So there's a constant balance going on, and that's what ISOs do. And one of the big risks with this is, I guess, the control over those markets. Again, if you have a large enough player, like a large commercial, like let's say a developer who comes in and wants to design a large battery system to provide grid stability, and they want to use this platform as a way to tie into the grid. On the one hand, they provide a service to the grid. On the other hand, the utility must assess the risk of failure on that system and other issues with interconnecting their technology onto the grid. Again, that can result in higher costs, not lower costs, for players within that grid. Basically, you need a grid that is robust enough to monitor the conditions on the system. And I'm not sure you can do all that at the residential level. You would need to also have some type of IEEE standards, in terms of timestamps to maybe represent that information from meters and translate that into the conditions on the grid. And looking at, different contingencies and limitations on the grid. So this gets into day-ahead and retail markets. Talks about here, they do forecasting, obviously. So ISOs operate what are called day-ahead markets, and basically gives producers enough time, like generators, time to plan their production and match what the market believes will be the demand one day in advance. Real-time market is exactly as it sounds. It is the market for buying and selling electricity in real time or near real time. So they're talking about here different intervals: 1 hour, 15 minutes, 5 minutes. Here's an example for Maine, and looking at different prices for power. You have the day ahead of price versus the real-time price. So this gets into some interesting things. It talks about how much energy a user will need tomorrow, or should he or she buy it in the day ahead markets, real-time markets, or some combination. So these are questions they're saying that the smart agent can answer. So this is very interesting in that it provides the opportunity and the control of the smart agent to make these decisions. Again, one thing with this, guys, is going to be scrutiny and assurance on the transparency of how the smart agent decides things, because it sounds like it's going to be more automatic. And whenever you get into those things, it's been my experience, and if you look at stuff on Ethereum, that things can be subject to manipulation. So one of the questions I would have for this team is, how do they guard against manipulation and spoof trading or front running on the markets? Because consumers could end up paying a lot more money if those protections aren't in place. So it says here, although energy storage has many benefits, the fact remains there does not yet exist a high degree of energy penetration. We already talked about that. It says here, as market incentives are updated. This is very interesting, because if you guys know anything about power systems and market incentives, what usually those result in is higher energy costs for everybody else. So you're basically socializing the deployment of these new technologies such as energy storage and solar. And listen, I'm a big proponent of solar and energy storage systems. I do enjoy them. I like them more, though, from the perspective of a true off-grid type system for maybe a house in like Costa Rica, just different systems like that. These guys are talking about more like California market incentives. And in those cases, again, those costs are basically furnished from the ratepayers themselves, and it jacks the costs up for everybody. So if you have one of the issues right now that people are debating or they have problems with is the fact that you have some people who have money to deploy, new technologies such as battery systems, solar systems, and they can actually get a discount or a rebate, and they can take advantage of those. And everybody's paying for those inherently through higher rates. So that's why you have high rates in California. If you go to areas like Arizona, you don't have so much of that, so the rates are a lot lower. And the requirements for where the power is procured is much more lenient. So again, you have lower costs, and it makes it such that deploying solar or battery systems in these states is not really viable at this time. Okay, if someone wants to be cool and just do it to be trendy, I mean, more power to them, but there's not there's not really an economic incentive to do it right now. So just wanted to kind of mention that to you guys. Not really sure that's going to pencil out totally. And you talk about here the power wall. So it gives a hypothetical here. It says, for example, if electricity is 10 kilowatts per hour from 6 to 8 a.m. and 25 from 4 to 6 p.m., they're saying a savvy arbitrator would be able to net 35 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's because they're going to buy, so they would buy the power, say in the morning, okay? And then they would sell the power here. Okay, then the net effect is 35 cents. That is true. Okay, so for a Tesla Powerwall, this would generate around $3.05 per day, or $1,275 per year, and that is true in a sense. But I guess that assumes that the worker or the person is not consuming that power during that time from 4 to 6. That's a possibility. It also assumes that there's enough capacity in the system to, I guess, to support that generation being fed back into the grid. Okay, because a lot of people now, a lot of utilities utilize these time of use systems, and so people who are aware of this simply just don't use any power during that time, and that takes care of the issue to begin with. Also, we have to think what happens when eventually the curves start to flatten based on these market dynamic strategies that are being deployed. Will the incentive for this 25 cents selling still exist? Market dynamics can change very quickly, so it's very hard to deduce these savings, quote unquote, per year as more of the technology maybe comes online. Again, another risk here. Demand response. What is demand response, guys? What it means is if a system has peak demand, meaning there's a lot of requests for power on the system, all demand response means is these smart devices, IoT devices like your appliances at home, they could have the ability to shut down for a short enough time. And what this allows is for the utility to maintain some grid stability, and they would potentially compensate you for this, for doing that. Now again, this is technology that exists today, okay? So it's not really new. I think the thing they're proposing here to do is to control more of those devices at a much more granular level. So today, in California, for example, a lot of this demand response applications are done, but they're done at the meter level. So it basically, curtails your demand at your house at the meter level. There are some pilots also at the appliance level. So again, I'm a little bit curious what value they're really bringing here. It doesn't seem like this really needs the blockchain, if you ask me, but I could be totally wrong. So yeah, that's another thing it does here. It allows you to basically control when the devices come on and off, reducing congestion in the distribution grid. So we already talked about that. It can also program your Tesla to determine when it should charge. But I mean, again, another application that already exists today. You don't need this device to do that. So I'm not trying to bag on this project. I'm just showing you guys some of these things already exist today, and I'm just trying to deduce what the value proposition here is. So now you have intelligent, economically driven decisions. So it talks about here if your smartphone periodically broadcasts your location, the smart agent would be able to figure out when you're leaving the house and when you're coming back. So this can, further turn things off, like if you're going to leave home for a long period of time on like a business trip, this can save you money. Again, one of the risks with this is the privacy concerns is one, and two, a lot of the stuff can be done today. So not a huge home run, but kind of cool, I guess, if you like it and you're okay with the, if they address the privacy concern. Secondary uses of the smart agent. One is storing cryptocurrency. Again, that's a secondary thing. It's not really that interesting to me. Proof of stake signing. This is, again, not really groundbreaking in my opinion, but, I can be wrong. Aetherium API for IoT. This can be pretty cool, I think. I don't know if you need I don't know if it'll be just this device, though, that comes out to do this. I think there'll be several vendors that offer this solution, so this is not unique in its own right. Now it talks about integration and testing. Looks like here, deploy code onto a specific 3 kilowatt-hour smart battery from a European producer, and they're rewriting much of the code in lower-level language for will be a large production deployment. So I'd be curious what that actually means. And they also say here that they look forward to experimenting on larger batteries, 14 kilowatt hours. 14 kilowatt hours, guys, is not a large battery. It would be considered large or adequately sized, I guess, for most residential applications. But I mean, if and it depends on what their application niche is. If they're also looking at commercial facilities, 14 kilowatt hours is not that large. There's actually much larger systems, either in production, in project mode at this time, or already deployed. So I'm kind of curious to see how all this, will interact with the grid controls. They would need to almost have some type of an API for all these, power companies. And the challenge with that, another risk, guys, here is most of these power companies do not have all the same SCADA systems on the distribution level. So my question is, how would they be able to facilitate management of that, or what type of partnership is involved with these systems? It's not as easy as it seems, guys. So this gets into the tokens. It talks about here the Bolt will be treated by Grid Plus as a stable coin, and it's basically $1 worth of energy. I guess my question though would be, will this be consistent for all users of Grid Plus, like around the world or around the U.S.? As you see, there's different prices for electricity around the globe. So I'm wondering how that will actually be done, especially because the prices change, right? Like, it's not stable always. If they're saying that there's going to be a market dynamic place for energy, how's that going to be controlled, I guess, and not subject to manipulation? Okay, so let's get into the next thing. The fee vault. Okay, we don't really need to get into that. The grid token. So now they have the grid token. So just to distinguish again, you have the Bolt tokens. Looks like the Bolt tokens are mainly for like purchases. Okay. And that makes sense because you want something that's stable. And then you have the grid token, and this is basically it's basically a redeemable by customers of Grid Plus platform for the right to purchase 500 kilowatts of electricity at the wholesale price. Okay, so that's interesting. I'd like to see how that, how that partnership is going to be done. And it doesn't also specify at what time. Like 500 kilowatts of electricity, is that, at 8 o'clock in the morning? Is that midday? Is that in the afternoon? Prices change for electricity, guys, so this isn't really, it's very vague what this actually means, and I think they just put that in there without maybe thinking it through, or maybe there's an FAQ that helps describe more of that, because I'm pretty sure prices for electricity changes throughout the day, and even it could be seasonal too, so not really entirely clear what that means. And the other thing is 500 kilowatts of electricity in California would be worth more than 500 kilowatts of electricity in Texas. So I think it says here in the relevant jurisdiction, but I wonder if anybody would think about some arbitrage play here to acquire these grid, these tokens, such that they could actually make more money by purchasing them for a location in a specific region with higher prices. Very interesting there. They talk about grid redemption limits here. I'm not going to get into that too much. They're saying that here Grid Plus will only allow a certain number of redeemed kilowatt hours to be applied in each region in each time period. So if more customers sign up with Grid Plus in a particular region, the limit to the periodic total redeemable kilowatt hours for that region should grow. Interesting. Distribution of grid. So it looks like here 30% will be sold, 25%, 20% to the founders, 25% of these locked up, 6, 12, 18 months, and the final 25 unlocked after 18 months. So that seems pretty standard. It doesn't really have I didn't see a price here for the Grid Plus tokens, but that would be interesting to know. I guess you could deduce what the value is by looking at, what the typical cost is for wholesale for electricity, and then multiplying that by the 300 million grid tokens. Okay, that would give you a sense for what their average, what they're basically valuing this at, initial market cap, and whether this is a good deal. Again, this is not investment advice, obviously, so just take everything I say with a grain of salt. But let's go back to the chart on Grid Plus and get the value. Okay, I don't want to use California because that wouldn't be very accurate for this application. So I'm going to go back and let's see if they have Texas here. They do. So Texas here, we're going to use 11 cents and 5.2 cents. Actually, we'd use 5.2 because it's kilowatt hours at the wholesale level. So, okay, so here we're back. Let's do 300 million times 0.052, and then we're going to divide that. Okay, guys, so they're valuing this at $15.6 million, which isn't too bad, I guess, if you consider the 300, million tokens. 15 million is not terrible, from that perspective, at least. But then, you have to ask yourself, given the risk and everything else with it, how much would this be worth? The value could be worth much more if the marketplace expands to other areas, but one specific geography alone, I'm not sure how much you could value something like this. That's where it becomes a little bit difficult. So that's one thing, guys. Let's go back to where we were. So business models next. Markup on energy. So charging the price of energy they purchase. And percent markup. So here's the wholesale and the residential. And if you can imagine, what they're looking to do, guys, is basically squeeze this down to this level. So an example here would be, here it shows around 13 cents. So if you use, if consumers use a technology like Grid Plus, they'd probably be more at the 9 to 10 cent level. So that would be, a savings of around, let's call it 25%. That's not too bad. Now, there's a lot of, just to let you guys know, there's a lot of cities and, people in general, governments that are looking at this same model, basically creating a retail consortium for purchasing the energy at the bulk level and passing that savings on to customers. So again, you don't necessarily need Grid Plus to do a lot of that. You can just, there's a lot of activities right now, people doing this kind of stuff. I'll show you LA. Let's see here if I can pull it up. Let's see, power retail. Okay, guys, bear with me here. I'm just going to pull up this article. Okay, so here's an example of it, guys. LA County creates a lower-cost alternative for Southern California Edison customers. This is talking about government-run utility. So what they did here is they approved the Public Energy Program, they're calling it, and they're saying it's a 5% savings. What this is it will get its power from green sources and provide it to customers at a lower cost. So it's just these types of examples where local governments are purchasing the power through what are called CCAs. They don't actually profit from the rates, so they are able to push those savings onto the consumers. It said program collectively saving around, let's see, 4.5%. Okay, so that kind of gives you guys an example of how these margins can be squeezed. I don't know, so you can imagine that obviously Grid Plus needs to make some money. So if they're making, let's say 2 or 3%, that would mean, the consumer saving around somewhere, probably around like 7 to 9%. I already gave you guys an example where in LA, they have similar initiatives to save customers, around 5%. So I'm not sure there's a huge proposition there, but we'll see. Rate and network transaction fees, so you have that as well. One of the questions will be here how that's going to work with all these transactions and payments. So if you do it on an hourly, quarter, 15-minute intervals or daily, I could see the Ethereum, just how Ethereum inherently works, those transaction fees adding up. But they're saying here that because of the rate-in system, fees charged will be extremely low. It's around 0.0001 cents per transactions. So yeah, I have to see how that actually works over time. On a typical, I haven't done the math on it, but it's every 15 minutes. And you have 4 of those. Let's see, 4 times, we have 30 days. So we have 2,880 transactions if you look at it in 15 minutes. So you multiply that by 0.0001. It's going to cost you around 30 cents if what they're claiming is true per month to make the fees if it's on a 15-minute basis. If it was on a 5-minute basis, it would be like just a little bit under $1. And obviously these will continue to increase as the intervals for payments go down, but I don't know. Interest on both deposits, they're also going to pay on that. Yes, this is, they're going to invest in low-risk assets such as treasury bills. I don't know, that will be interesting to see how that works. That's all I'm going to say about that, actually. I don't know what they make on that, but okay. Sales of smart agents, looks like a manufacturing cost is around $50 they're claiming. And they're saying that this device will have more functionality than a Trezor or Ledger. But I think they're going to sell the smart agents at cost. $50 still seems like quite a bit. I'm wondering if that's because of the low amount of units they'll be manufacturing initially. So here's the roadmap, guys. Phase 1 is the Edison Epoch, Q4 2017 to Q3. I'm kind of curious what that, I think that's in Texas then. Maybe, I'm not sure. It's not Southern California Edison, it's Edison Epoch. So looks like they're going to do a pilot and sign up to 5,000 plus customers. Probably give away the hardware for free, or at a reduced cost, I would think. And then Grid Plus will need to contract with a marketer who's familiar with marketing utilities. Okay, Smart Agent Prototype. You guys already received an explanation of what that is. So this Smart Agent's in charge of basically buying and selling the power for the consumer. So during this phase, they'll hire 3 hardware engineers. And then Carl will be overseeing the prototyping, testing, and production. We're going to look at here to establish the content delivery network. This is basically a process in which the Smart Agent fetches updates from the hub. And this is more the software side. And this is critical to streamlining updates and enabling fast iteration. So, building the plumbing, remote logging updates for the client. Okay, that kind of makes sense. Updates to the client. There's another one here. So 2 additional software engineers for that. This includes like sign-up pages, open payment channels, and withdrawals. And then they will also spend more time on the REST API. So phase 2 is the Tesla Epoch. This is around 100,000 to 200,000 customers in 2 to 4 markets. I would anticipate maybe California being one of those markets. That'll be interesting. And because of the, let's see, they will increase the liquidity of the Bolt token by decreasing transaction fees and scaling the hardware production. And they have their manufacturing engineer quantity here. More updates. Interesting that they are naming this the Tesla phase. More marketers, Raiden Hub. Okay. During this phase, Grid Plus will allow optional API data feeds to send encrypted data to the smart agents. So the way I interpret this, guys, is the APIs that interface to those devices, such as Nest. This will be the phase that happens at. And once again, that is Q4 2018 to Q3 2019. So you're waiting almost at least another year, guys, if you're into that, for that functionality. So Q1, again, just to review, will be the Smart Agent Prototype and basic bare functionality. Okay, so signing up, it looks like payments and withdrawals. Phase 2 is the hardware production ramping up, Raiden Hub, and then the API interface. So it won't be there yet, guys. And then Q4, which is Q4 2019 and beyond, this is the full hardware production scalability. And this is really working with multiple hardware manufacturers and making an extremely scalable solution. So it'll require more people and a smart agent AI optimization. So taking what they learned from probably the next 1.5 years, and then optimizing the intelligence, the artificial intelligence. And this is really key because their whole project stems on being able to buy and sell power, through this device. And then they're claiming to go international. So this gets into the use of funds. I'm not going to get into that too much. There's the allocation of the resources, token sale funds by topic or area. So, I think it's very interesting, guys. One thing I would say is I'm a little bit curious about is I notice here the legal is a very small component, largely speaking. And I'm curious about if that needs to actually be more because of the fact that this challenge doesn't really stem from user acquisition. A big challenge of this is going to be getting the regulators to give the nod for this, in my opinion, and to make it ubiquitous to be used on the systems, because it could also be seen as like a predatory device if you're charging consumers, money for this, and then allowing the consumers who have this device to have lower fees for energy, and maybe there's some consumers that can't afford it. So usually when you have these systems, they basically have to either be deployed throughout the system or not. And that's just my opinion. The other issue I mentioned to you guys early was like solar systems in a more affluent area where the rates could be lower versus, or even Tesla Powerwalls versus areas that don't have it. How does the team deal with that? And then there's the price, volatility, or this whole notion of the stable tokens. So a number of things, guys. In my opinion, I think technically this is a neat project. I don't know if it's fully thought through, especially at the distribution grid level, and how these distributed energy resources interact with the grid, and what are the implications for that in terms of if you have more of these DER systems, what types of upgrades are needed on the grid. That usually requires higher costs, which most utilities don't have today. In California, just to give you guys some perspective, there's been some work recently, like as of last year, to harden the grid and get it ready for these for this type of architecture. But throughout the United States, this is not the case. So again, this usually results in higher fees for consumers. And my question is, how is that going to be balanced, in this environment? Because it's not really clear right now. And California is obviously trying to do it, but it's very challenging. So in a nutshell, guys, I like this project technically, but I am not a fan of, like from an Ethereum token standpoint, maybe holding these until I know more about the pilot and understand a little bit more about some of the answers to some of those questions. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please consider subscribing to my channel. And this is Wolf Crypto signing off. Peace.